Hey there, listeners. Before we begin, I wanted to jump on to remind you that right now we've got our first ever subscriber sale going on. An annual subscription is 20% off, meaning you get twice the number of episodes, the videos, and more for just $5 a month. Head over to gdpolitics.com right now to claim it. That's gdpolitics.com. All right, here's the show. Guys, I have somewhat big news.
Oh?
CBS is buying GD Politics.
for $150 million. You guys get ready. Okay, so I've been teasing this for kind of a while now, but we are rebranding, and I think it's going to happen this week. Have I showed this to you? Have
No.
I showed you the new podcast art?
I don't think you have.
Okay, get ready. Here we go.
Oh, this is great. This is amazing.
Very cool. It's very retro.
Yeah, I'm a big fan.
I love it.
Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk. The government has now been shut down for 6 days, and there's no clear end in sight, let alone any palpable urgency to reach that end. During past government shutdowns, there has at least been the sense that lawmakers are earnestly trying to find a path forward. Why not this time? Perhaps we need not look any further than the polls. The bulk of polling suggests Americans blame Republicans more than Democrats, so Democrats may not feel the pressure to fold. But historically, polling also suggests that the party making the demands that caused the shutdown, in this case Democrats, are eventually seen as responsible and fold after achieving little to no policy concessions. So Republicans aren't feeling the pressure to compromise probably either. Today, we're going to dig deeper into those surveys and try to get a sense of where things might go from here. We're also going to focus on a couple of other polls that have attracted attention recently. Yes, it is a polling-heavy day. Grab that calculator, put on those stats nerd glasses. I promise it will be fun. So, the New York Times released its first national poll since April, after months of newsworthy developments and political rancor, resulting in, wait for it, no discernible change in how Americans view Trump and Democrats. There's also a new poll out of Pennsylvania showing Democratic Senator John Fetterman as a relatively popular figure in the state. Just one important footnote. He is 20 points underwater with his own party's voters and 40 points above water with Republicans. So is this a roadmap for other Democrats to win over Republican voters, or a one-way ticket to a primary challenge and an ouster from Washington? Here with me to discuss it all is friend of the pod, Mary Radcliffe. Welcome, Mary.
Good morning, Galen. How's it going?
It's going well. We're talking about your home state senator today. Are you excited?
I'm so excited you're going to finally let me talk about Pennsylvania politics.
That was the first thing you said when you logged on today. We're talking about Pennsylvania. I was like, we are. Also here with us is senior data scientist at the Washington Post and dear friend of the pod, Lenny Bronner. Welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
Are you as excited to talk about Pennsylvania?
Always. Well, maybe not quite as excited as Mary is, but, also excited.
I promise we'll get back to Europe next time. In case any of your commentary on France didn't make it into the cold open.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so Mary, I characterized the polling a little bit, but let's elaborate. What do surveys show so far about who is being blamed for the shutdown?
I don't think I have seen a single survey where more people blame Democrats than Republicans for this shutdown. There's been a bunch of polls, and all of them show that voters are blaming Trump and Republicans more than Democrats. A quick note, there's a variety of wordings here. So sometimes polls will break out, like, do you blame Trump, Republicans, or Democrats? Sometimes they lump Trump and Republicans together. There doesn't seem to be much difference between those surveys, but just a flag that it's not entirely apples and apples here. There's not quite an orange either, but something that's a little related. But if you look at surveys since September that have asked about this, even before the shutdown, asking hypothetically who voters will blame, and you just average the percent of voters that blame Trump and Republicans versus those that blame Democrats, on average, you get 42% of respondents blaming Trump and Republicans and 28% blaming Democrats. So that's a margin of about 14 points in the Democrats' favor. The most favorable survey to Republicans in this matter was, in fact, that New York Times Siena survey that you were mentioning, where they had 26% blaming Trump and Republicans, 19% blaming Democrats, and 33% blaming both equally. So it's a margin of 7 points. That's the most favorable that we've seen for Republicans. So it's pretty consistent.
Yeah, Mary, you were talking about survey wording, and I was going to bring up that New York Times survey before you even mentioned it, because in a lot of surveys, they force you to choose one. But the New York Times lets you choose both equally as an option for who to blame. And that gets the plurality of respondents. So a third of respondents said they blame both equally. Should we make much of that in the sense that other surveys aren't asking this and are getting higher numbers for Republicans?
There are some that are asking this, though, right? So YouGov and CBS News poll that came out on Sunday did offer both equally, and it did not get the plurality. Trump and Republicans in Congress got the plurality. So in that survey, you had 39% saying Trump and Republicans, 30% saying Democrats, 31% saying both equally. So that's a margin of 9 points in the Democrats' favor and not a plurality on that both equally. Notably, in the YouGov CBS News poll, though, they did not offer an undecided option. They forced, like the New York Times does. The New York Times offers the option for people to say, like, I actually don't know. YouGov CBS News didn't offer that option, so that may have pushed more people to make a choice that might have impacted that top line a little bit. But also, I mean, there's another high-quality survey that came out last week from Marist, NPR, and PBS News also had that both equally, and still the Trump and Republicans in Congress got the plurality in that survey as well.
I want to talk more about that New York Times poll, both while we're talking about the shutdown and then later on as well. But first, Lenny, I want to throw it to you because this serves as a contrast with historical precedent. Typically, what happens is the party that's making the demands that provokes the shutdown is seen by the public as responsible. There are some caveats here because historically that's also been Republicans. So you could say, well, historically Americans blame Republicans, or you could say historically Americans blame the party that provokes the shutdown. And either way, you'd kind of be right. But what do you make of Americans blaming Republicans in this instance when not only is it pretty clear that Democrats are the ones, I mean, maybe it's not clear to most voters, but not only are Democrats making the demands themselves, they also telegraphed this for months in advance after feeling like maybe they missed the opportunity to shut the government down last time.
I think that's a great question. I do wonder to what extent part of this is driven by the fact that people are used to the idea that Republicans are the party that shuts down government. In the past, that's been the case. There was an interesting survey by KFF about how many people actually know what this fight is about, or like really know that, you know, these ACA subsidies are expiring. And the actual number of people, Americans that know this, are like pretty small. And so like if you amongst the people that do know, maybe the percentage is higher of, you know, people that blame the Democrats. Though I think, you know, negative polarization and the fact that these people are more likely to be partisan Democrats at this point, education polarization and negative polarization working together here means that these people probably also blame Republicans. But so sort of maybe low information voters that have tended towards maybe gravitating towards Trump in recent years, maybe don't even know the fact that this might be happening and therefore are maybe more likely to blame Republicans because that's been historically what has happened.
Or simply because Republicans control all levers of government as far as
exactly. I mean, that's another easy sort of, you think about who's controlling government. You know that Trump won the last election. You know, maybe that Republicans are, you know, have a trifecta. And then you're like, well, if the government isn't functioning, well, then clearly the party is to blame that is running the government.
I also think it's worth noting that, like, the Republicans and Trump in particular made a big show about publicly refusing to negotiate with Democrats on this, right? Prior to the shutdown, Schumer and Jeffries were trying to get meetings with Trump and talk this out. And instead of doing good faith negotiations, he posted AI-generated memes on social media. So I think there's also like,
wait, you mean that isn't winning over the median voter, Mary?
I don't think so, no. And I mean, the Republicans themselves are telegraphing, like, no, we will not compromise with you. So that may also be partly shaping how voters are perceiving this.
Well, that makes me think about two things. One is when it comes to who is being blamed in the public's eye, who seems to be responsible for the shutdown, Trump is making a big show of, you know, we're going to have across the board layoffs within the federal government. We're not sending money to places like New York or Chicago, other blue locales across the country. And on one hand, that may be popular with Republicans and showing that, you know, Democrats think they're going to pull one over on us, but actually we control the levers of government and we're going to make the shutdown painful if the shutdown is what they want. But it also might give Americans the impression that Trump is in charge of the shutdown in a way. Like if you're the one saying, I'm not going to send money or I'm not going to fund this or we're going to lay everyone off, you're kind of saying like, I'm going to be doing these things.
Honestly, it feels like that approach is of a piece with what we've seen from the Trump administration so far, right? Like picking perceived political enemies as targets. Like we see this with the law firms and the universities and so on, where Trump is just like unilaterally like, I'm going to withhold money from these perceived democratic institutions until they do the things I want. It's sort of a piece, I think. So I don't know that there's much different there than what voters are already seeing from the Trump administration.
Well, and if it is no different from what voters are already seeing from the Trump administration, we know from that New York Times polling that it's not popular. So oftentimes Americans will agree with Trump's sentiment, right? We want stricter rules when it comes to immigration or crime or what have you. But then the methods that Trump uses are ultimately not popular.
I mean, an example of that would be like the immigration stuff, where people still very much trust Republicans over Democrats to be on their side of immigration more broadly. But then a majority of Americans, I think, are not happy with the administration's moves in immigration in particular. They think they're going too far on deporting people, but they're still sort of broadly speaking aligned with them on where they think the party stands. I will add, though, Galen, like you asked whether you think like Trump, what he is signaling makes it even more likely that people will think that, he wants to shut down and therefore blame Republicans. I mean, I would say a large majority of Democratic signaling has also been that they are happy to have this shutdown. So I do think it sort of goes both ways. I mean, they are more subtle than Trump is, but, I think everyone is more subtle than Donald Trump.
Well, are they that much more subtle? Because I read basically an op-ed a day from Democrats arguing we should shut the government down and we should do it for this reason. No, we should shut the government down and we should do it for that reason in the month plus leading up to the shutdown, which then led to this kind of insane moment. Folks, I hope you weren't watching this as it unfolded because it's just like very online politics, which I don't think affects anything. But journalists describing the shutdown as being provoked by Democrats had Democratic spokespeople being like, this is bad reporting. This is inaccurate. Democrats are not shutting the government down. And it's like, wait, okay, Democrats, you can't telegraph this 4 months and show that you're remorseful for not shutting the government down months ago. And then when you actually do it, be like, no, you're all wrong. We're not shutting the government down. It felt a little like, are you telling me I can't see what I can plainly see and I can't hear what I can plainly hear?
Yeah, the Democratic messaging has been very muddled.
Because then at the same time, you still have some Democratic lawmakers proudly being like, no, we did shut the government down because we want Americans to have their ACA subsidies. And what Republicans are doing to healthcare is unacceptable. And it's like, pick a lane, girls.
I mean, I think they're wrestling with themselves a little bit. There are still a segment of the Democratic Party that is very much like mostly institutionalists and are unhappy with the idea that shutting down the government would be good for any sort of, any sort of situation.
You also have other Democratic senators out there messaging on like the lawlessness of the Trump administration, which I think is like particularly difficult messaging in this circumstances. When we talked about this a few weeks ago, Galen, one of the arguments that I made is you can't just like shut the government down for the entire Trump administration. If you believe it to be a lawless administration, that would be the response. But like, that's not going to happen. So I feel like that messaging is also confused in there.
We got a question from a listener that gets at what we mean when we even use the word blame, or what respondents to these polls understand when we use the word blame. Because on one hand, you could say, for example, Democrats are shutting the government down over ACA subsidies. They are to blame. Or you could say Republicans are phasing out ACA subsidies and they're, creating new requirements and essentially cuts to Medicaid that have provoked Democrats to shut the government down. So they're to blame. So in some sense, the listener question that we got was like, what do we even make of this polling when it says, oh, I blame Republicans or I blame Democrats?
To first point, listener, you think way more about politics than most people. And that's okay. But most people for most people, it's not that deep. It's really not. Half the polling, probably more than half of what we're seeing is just knee-jerk partisan responses from respondents, and that's fine. And the other half is based on like one headline that someone saw, right? So like, it's okay if you think about politics more than most people, but most people are not going that far on this. They haven't even read one article or listened to one podcast. They're like, Republicans are intransigent. I blame Republicans. I believe that is mostly the extent of it. they probably don't even know what they're being intransigent about. It's just that voters have learned over the past however many shutdowns that it is Republicans who are generally intransigent. I don't know. Lenny, do you have any other thoughts?
No, I think that's totally right. That's sort of very much related to what I said earlier. I think when people hear government shutdown, they assume that it is the Republicans shutting down the government because that's been the case the last, 3 or 4 times. Even the shutdowns that came, that never happened, where it just came close, at least in the last 15 years, it's been mostly driven by Republicans. I will add one more thing though, which is I mean, if we really want to dissect this, what does blame mean? I guess it's the party most likely to take a hit if the shutdown continues or something. But I think sort of one of the reasons we're seeing the fact that they're barely negotiating, everyone seems pretty chill about this, is the fact that they've both learned, I mean, especially Republicans have learned, that the hit doesn't last very long, if it exists at all. I mean, especially Donald Trump, who shut down the government in 2018 over his border wall. I guess you could argue he lost the next presidential election, but I don't think he lost that election because he shut down the government 2 years prior. So even if he had a hit, it was pretty short-lived, it went away again. And so what does blame even mean, I think, is sort of a question that I think the two parties are asking themselves and realizing that maybe there is no impact to being blamed here.
Yeah. I would refer back to that conversation we had a couple weeks ago with Nathaniel Rakich, that both Nathaniel and I, arguing on opposite sides of whether this was a good move politically for the Democrats, conceded that electorally it probably won't matter.
What does this all mean for what happens next? You see people arguing, more Americans are blaming Republicans than Democrats. This means that Democrats have some leverage here to make their demands and hold out until Republicans say, all right, maybe we will extend these Affordable Care Act subsidies, which various Republicans have suggested they want to do anyway, but they just don't want to be tied to government shutdown negotiations. So everyone pull out your crystal ball. How does this end if you're saying that it seems like neither party feels that there are incentives to caving?
Well, the incentives will manifest over time as impacts of the shutdown grow, right? In the early days of the shutdown, generally people are not feeling any impacts. But the longer this goes on, the more they're going to have to make changes in how the government is spending its money. You could see things like Social Security being impacted, the delivery of Medicare funds, for example. So if it goes on too long, they're going to have to do something because Americans are going to be furious. Wait,
hold on. That conflicts a little bit with the in the end, it doesn't even matter narrative.
Well, I mean, I say in the end, it doesn't even matter, but I'm comparing that, of course, to past shutdowns. The longest one we ever had was the one in 2018 and 2019 that Lenny was just talking about. That was 35 days, right? So that's the longest shutdown we've ever had. If this goes on longer than 35 days, I think we don't know what happens in such a circumstance.
Okay.
You said that Democrats want this passed. Republicans aren't opposed to this passing, the ACA subsidies, but don't want it tied to the shutdown. I think it might be instructive to look at, the other shutdown that happened in 2018, which was in early 2018, which was only lasted 2 days. So in some case, maybe what we'll end up seeing is a combination of those two 2018 shutdowns. But what happened there was that Democrats wanted protection passed for Dreamers, and the GOP didn't want to negotiate until after funding. So actually a similar situation that we're running into now. And in the end, Democrats blinked. And the Republicans committed to holding a vote, I think, a month later or something like that. And obviously, I think this time around, it'll stretch out a lot longer than 2 days. I mean, it already has. But I think something like a deal like this may be on the table, once the parties start feeling pain.
So one resolution could be they don't actually get funding for extending Affordable Care Act subsidies in whatever continuing resolution gets passed, but there's an agreement that we'll deal with this later on. And it's been brought up on this podcast before that in some ways, Democrats are trying to force Republicans to do something that will ultimately be politically advantageous for them, right? If Republicans continue to refuse to extend Affordable Care Act subsidies, and that ends up being the case through the next midterms, that's a point of vulnerability because Americans are going to experience significant increases for the people who purchase their plans on, as individuals on the open market. And that is presumably something that could make some voters mad, maybe mad enough to vote.
Yeah, it could also impact people who don't purchase insurance on the open market because insurance companies may have to raise premiums on others because hospitals still have to treat people without insurance. So there's potentially some ripple effects outside of the ACA marketplace as well.
one more thing before we move on. There's been this argument that Democrats aren't really doing this for the median voter. That Democrats are doing this for the base. And you see in that New York Times poll, they asked, should Democrats shut the government down if their demands are not met? A plurality of Democrats say yes, 47%. Everyone else says no. So it's like 92% of Republicans say no, obviously. But amongst independents, it's unpopular. So 60% of independents said Democrats should not shut the government down if their demands are not met. We'll see if over time more voters come to realize that that is in fact what's happened and then sour on Democrats. Who knows? But there is the argument that at the end of the day, Democratic leadership is doing this for that 47% of Democrats, that Chuck Schumer enters this phase of politics as the least popular leader in Washington in an era of unpopular leaders. He stands out as being underwater with his own partisan voters, according to a recent Pew poll. And so Democrats are just doing this for their base. Is that what they're doing?
Two things. The first thing is, the polling is a little bit all over the place there because we also had a poll at the Washington Post that asked this got at the same question. And there it was like 3/4 of Democrats wanted the extension and was also happy to see the government shut down. So like the numbers do vary a little bit there. How many Democrats actually want this to happen. The second point I wanted to make is that you said that it's mostly for the base and not for the median voter. And I think the Democrats actually want this both ways. One criticism that we have heard, for example, Nate Silver makes this criticism, is that they should have picked something that isn't like the ACA subsidies, which, leaves them with something that they couldn't hit the Republicans over the head with come midterm time. This is sort of bad for them strategically speaking. But I think they chose this partially because it's bad for them strategically speaking. Shutting down the government is playing to their base, but picking something that the median voter can understand and is popular with the median voter is actually, throwing a bone to the median voter in that sense. If they had picked something that, like I think Nate Silver proposes that they picked something like tariffs, I think that would have been playing to the base on both accounts of shutting down the government and tariffs versus this is something that I think, the subsidies are popular amongst a vast majority of Americans, even amongst a large chunk of Republicans. And so like that is sort of the strategy here, which is doing something that is popular amongst the base, but picking the fight on something that is popular across the board.
Wait, but Trump is less popular on trade than he is on healthcare, which is saying something because he's not popular on healthcare. Like, wouldn't tariffs still be a median voter appeal? Like, make this whole thing about cost of living, everything is too expensive and we're trying to...
I think it's like a lot less emotional than ACA subsidies.
I also think it is, like, the ACA subsidies is something that, like, is clearly within congressional control, whereas with tariffs, you have ongoing litigation about like what actually is under the purview of the executive branch versus the legislative branch. So that's a much messier fight. I do want to flag one thing about the polling that you're talking about there, Lenny. One thing I think is really important to note is that the Washington Post poll was conducted after the government shut down, whereas the New York Times poll was conducted before the government shut down. And something that we consistently see in surveys is once your party is doing something, you're like, yes, I approve of that thing. When it's still like question mark, are they going to do it? You might get more split responses like you see in that New York Times survey. But with the Washington Post survey, post-shutdown, Democrats are like, yes, I approve of what the Democrats are doing because that is what they are doing and that's my party. So you may have some like impact on how people are viewing this because it is actually happening, right? Something becomes popular among Republicans once Trump does it, for example.
Also, in contrasting the New York Times and Washington Post polls, you have hit on a secret, hidden good data, bad data, or not data segment within this broader segment. And this will also transition us to a larger conversation about that New York Times Siena College poll. But according to Nate Cohn, who did a write-up of this poll in the Times, as part of the paper's experimentation to try to get the most accurate polling possible, they polled Americans both by calling them, which is how they've traditionally done it, and also texting Americans, which is a new method for them. And they found that the text sample was far more Democratic leaning than the phone call only sample. Now, this is significant, obviously, because we've had a decade now of polls that are overestimating support for Democrats, underestimating support for Republicans. The Times, Nate Cohn in particular, has been pretty adamant about not waiting to recalled vote, even as other polling houses have made the shift in order to make sure they're getting the correct number of sort of Trump-aligned respondents. But because the sample in the text poll was so democratically aligned. I think it favored Harris by 6 percentage points in recall. Whereas obviously we know that Trump won by, about a 1.5 in the national popular vote. So that's sort of the sample, even after waiting for other aspects, was still skewed towards Democrats by 7.5 points. So because of that, they ended up weighting the text sample by recalled vote to try to make it reflect what is reality. And then once they did that, the text sample looked more like the phone call only sample. All that is to say, we know from that experiment that in this moment, it's likely that a text poll is going to get a more democratic sample. Take that lesson and apply it to the Washington Post poll, which was very positive for Democrats. It was like, everyone's blaming Republicans and all Americans want extensions of the Affordable Care Act subsidies. That was a text-only poll. Taking all of that together, and I know I've mentioned 2 polls here, good data, bad data, not data, the New York Times versus the Washington Post. And Lenny, I know this is your paper of employment, so I want to give you the opportunity to respond first here.
So generally, I would say this is not just good data, it's great data. I mean, pollsters should be experimenting with other methods. I mean, we currently are in a crisis of polling, response rates, the issues we've been seeing around bias in recent elections. So it's good to do more work on this and to try and come up with better solutions. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is that the Washington Post poll, even though it was text only, did weight towards 2024 recall. And therefore, if you agree with what Nate wrote, that fixed the issue in their poll, that it sort of moved that towards their phone poll results, then, the Washington Post did address that issue and sort of we should be able to trust that poll. It is still the best poll for Democrats, but it is in no means sort of a huge outlier compared to some of the other polls that we've been seeing on the same issue. So I'm always of the opinion that we should be taking the average of polls and that there's no different in this case. Only because I work at the Washington Post doesn't mean I think we should be using the Washington Post poll over the average of the polls on this issue.
Oh, such a mensch.
I actually agree with Lenny. I think this is good data. I read what Nate Cohn wrote about this, and I think, first of all, the differences between the phone sample and the text sample weren't so huge. You mentioned that the text sample was a recalled vote of +6 Harris. The phone sample was also 2 Democratic in recalled vote. It was recalled vote of Harris +1, which is off by 2.5 points. And there's only a 5-point difference there, right? So a 5-point difference. I mean, this is what weighting is for, first of all, is that you're not going to get a perfect sample every time you do a survey. I also think this is a great argument for what most of our gold star, best pollsters are already doing, which is mixed methodology surveys. There may be real organic reasons why your text survey and your phone survey look different from each other. Younger people, for example, might be more willing to take a survey text or online versus over the phone. They don't want to talk on the phone with people. I'm not even that young and I don't want to talk on the phone with people, right? So you might be getting some real and organic differences in the way people prefer to communicate. And I think a lot of our highest quality pollsters are generally mixing methodologies. So the Marist survey that was on this, for example, is phone and text and online opt-in panel as a third methodology here. The Washington Post poll was entirely text, but that was a flash poll, right? It was a one-day quick response sort of survey. When Washington Post does, it's more complete surveys, they're larger national omnibus type surveys. They do mixed methodology. New York Times obviously is using mixed methodology. This is now what I would expect from a gold star pollster is to use multiple modes to make sure that they're talking to people across demographics, across different sorts of communication methods. I generally, if I see something that's entirely one methodology, that's a flag to me that they probably had to weight it pretty hard. So anyway, that's my take. This is a great argument for mixed mode polling, which most great pollsters are already doing.
I'll add one more small thing, which is, Galen, you mentioned in the beginning of the segment that the sample that the New York Times got for the text poll was leaned to Democratic, and that might be a bias issue, especially the Washington Post poll you mentioned, also looked better for Democrats than a lot of other polls, and maybe that's the same issue, even though, the Washington Post did go through this weighting. I will say that the other possible answer here is that actually there's not more bias amongst texting, but just more variance. And so the results would be jumping around more. I mean, I could definitely imagine a scenario in which text polls have higher variance than phone polls. You're just, have a lot more uncertainty about who you're going to end up reaching. And so, I mean, I just think we just need more investigation here about what's going on. And that's another reason why I think it's good that media organizations and pollsters are experimenting here.
The other thing I would add here, thinking about text polling, one thing I wonder is how the wording of the invitation to the survey might impact click-throughs. So, like, if you are texted a survey and it's like, hey, we're from the New York Times, are Democrats going to be more likely to click that link and Republicans going to be like, New York Times, right?
Well, Mary, get ready, because I have some primary source data on how the New York Times went about this, because I got polled by the New York Times Siena College for their New York City mayoral race, and it did not mention the New York Times at all. The only institution mentioned was Siena College, which for people, I mean, at least for people who are based in New York, which is what this poll was, geared towards, they know, it's a college upstate. It's not an elite university. It's not like an Ivy League, whatever. So at least in that instance, any reference to the New York Times was removed.
Yeah, but would that work as well for a national survey where like someone in Kentucky or whatever has like never heard of Siena College?
Yeah.
Right, like if I didn't follow polling, I would never have heard of Siena College.
Yeah, this is true.
Me neither, and I live in New York City.
Okay, with all that said, we love an example of good data, nay, great data. We have one more thing to talk about when it comes to that New York Times poll, but first, a break. We're going to get back to the podcast in just a moment, but before we do, I want to remind you that conversations like this are only possible because of you, the listeners. In the 7 months since 538 Shutdown, we've been able to launch and sustain a podcast that emphasizes curiosity, rigor, and a sense of humor because of you. Become a part of that project today at gdpolitics.com. In particular, do it right now because annual subscriptions are 20% off. That's just $5 a month. You get a second weekly podcast, videos, and more. But the deal goes away this Friday. To be honest, sometimes this job makes me feel like a furniture salesman over Memorial Day weekend, but it's worth it. Head to gdpolitics.com right now for our best deal on a sofa. To get a second weekly podcast and much more for 20% off. gdpolitics.com. All right, back to the show. As I mentioned at the top, that New York Times poll that we have been discussing was the first national poll that the paper did since April. And now Nate Cohn is going to end up getting a lot of play in this podcast, but I'm going to quote his top line takeaway from that poll, and then I want to get your thoughts. So he wrote, "It can be hard to remember all the news since the last New York Times Siena University poll." I guess they changed their name. Okay, the artist formerly known as Siena College, now Siena University. So it's been hard to remember all the news since the last New York Times Siena University poll in April. So here's a quick list. President Trump paused many tariffs and enacted others. Elon Musk left his Department of Government Efficiency. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was brought back to the United States. Republicans passed their enormous tax and spending bill. National Guard troops were deployed to Los Angeles. The United States bombed Iran. There was an uproar over releasing the Jeffrey Epstein files. The federal government took over Washington, D.C. Charlie Kirk was assassinated. Yet despite it all, unchanged is probably the best description of the findings from today's Times Siena poll. Mr. Trump's approval rating is at 43%, about the same as the 42% who approved in April. His disapproval rating is unchanged from 54%. Similarly, Democrats led by 2 percentage points in the race for Congress. That's about the same as their 3-point lead in April. What should we make, Lenny, we'll start with you this time, of this stasis in the face of a whole lot of political upheaval?
So the first thing I'll say is that, this really isn't that new. I mean, Donald Trump has been in the media environment as sort of a presidential candidate and as a president for 10 years now. And in his first term, we also saw the fact that, very little actually had an impact on his approval rating. His approval rating, went down quickly in the beginning and then sort of, stagnated for a while, bobbing around here and there. Decreased sometimes when something important was in the news, and I'll get back to this in a second, but mostly sort of staying stable. We're seeing the same thing now. Donald Trump's approval rating went down in the beginning of his term and sort of has stabilized again. I will say, though, that, the New York Times poll in April was on the lower side for Trump. So, if you do take a look at the averages, and I took a look at both the Silver Bulletin average and the Strength in Numbers average, Donald Trump's approval rating has gone down from early April to now. The numbers are slightly different, but in both of them, it's around 3 to 4 percentage points. So, like I said, in April, the New York Times poll was one on Trump's lower side. Now it's pretty much smack dab in the middle of all the polling average. So, there has, I think, if you take a look at the average, been some change, though, less change than, I think you could have expected given all the news that's happened. Though, to the the final point here, which is political stuff, the political discourse doesn't seem to harm him that much. Policy stuff does seem to harm him. The Obamacare repeal in the first term, we saw a decrease in his approval rating. Tariffs this time around, when he first announced Liberation Day, he took a hit in his approval rating, but recovered from that. So, there are things that do have an actual impact in his approval rating, even if some of them are sort of like short-lived. And I guess we'll just have to see, if the economy does sort of weaken, as we've seen some indications of, whether that it will actually have a larger impact on his approval rating than some of the more like political discourse and democracy-adjacent stuff that Democrats are trying to use as ways of making him less popular.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, Lenny. And correct me if I'm wrong, but actually another point in Trump's first term where his approval rating dropped noticeably was during that 35-day government shutdown when he was demanding funding for the border wall, right?
Yeah, that's right, Galen. During that shutdown in the first Trump administration, you did see a big drop in Trump's approval rating during that shutdown in the first term. So that could be upcoming for us. Who knows?
Yeah, we're going to be on approval watch. We're a decade into it, and we're not stopping now.
but just to make sure people don't think we're sort of contradicting what we said earlier, like his approval rating then recovered again after the shutdown ended, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
almost
absolutely.
right back to where it was before. No, I think this is one more point in the LOL, nothing matters approach to politics, which is that people are just pretty dug in their partisan positions, right? A lot of stuff changes. And Lenny was saying Trump's approval rating has shifted since early April. But just to be very clear, I'm looking at the polling average that Elliot and I have up at Strength in Numbers. Yes, it's shifted within a band of 2 or 3 percentage points. It doesn't really change that much. 2 or 3 percentage points could basically, in some cases, just depend on which pollsters have recently released data because of certain methodological choices or particular sampling frame, whatever, maybe always on the low side or always on the high side for Trump. These changes are very, very small. So, as I said earlier, most people are not thinking about politics all that much, right? It seems like a whirlwind of stuff has happened when you're a close political observer and you're this and then this and then this and then this. But I don't actually know for sure how much all of that breaks through to regular everyday people. If it does break through, is it just I'll put that on the pile of I don't like Trump and he's doing something I don't like again, or I do like Trump and this is a bold move. I don't know. I don't know how much these things are interpreted in detail by voters.
Yeah. That being said, this poll contained a lot of information that wasn't just do Americans like Trump or do Americans like Democrats. And one thing that stuck out to me, because we do mention this kind of issue polling a fair amount on this podcast, is that, Gallup regularly asks, what's the most important challenge facing America today? And we often cite the responses from all Americans that tend to be economic concerns. But that could be masking something that the New York Times breaks out in a bit of detail. They ask Democrats, independents, and Republicans separately, what's the top issue for you right now? For Democrats, 18% of them said Mr. Trump and Republicans is the top concern. Nearly as many Republicans, 16%, said that it's Democrats that are the nation's biggest problem. And independents' top concern was polarization and division. So if you were to add that into, sort of compare that to Gallup, individually, Republicans, Democrats, partisan division, none of them are going to rise to the top to outrank the economy as the most important issue. But if you just say, what is the percentage of Americans for whom their biggest issue is each other? All of a sudden, according to this New York Times polling, that's the biggest challenge facing the country that Americans identify, and it's even bigger than the economy. So I thought that was notable to pull out because it serves as a bit of a contrast to what we usually say, which is everyone's biggest concern is the economy. And I should also note, this is polling that's being done in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination and a lot of the rancor and fallout from that. So it could be a reaction to this moment in time, but also this is not a totally isolated moment. It's reflective of something broader in American politics. So one, you can respond to that if you like, or two, if there was another piece of data that stuck out to you in this poll that you want to mention before we talk about Pennsylvania politics, now's your opportunity.
I want to pick on methodology again, Galen. I'm such a dork.
Well, good thing everyone already has their calculators and stats nerd glasses on.
Both Gallup and the New York Times offer this most important issue as what's called an open-ended question. So in that type of response, they don't provide a list of options to the voters. They just say, hey, what do you think is the most important problem? And then the voter will say something, and then they write it down. And then later they go through all those responses and categorize them and code them and whatever. Now, we've talked before about in the Gallup polling how in the last couple of years, the top two buckets they make for these open-ended responses are economic problems and the government or poor leadership. Notably, they don't break out categories for Democrats, Trump, Republicans. Are those things included in government poor leadership in the Gallup survey? I don't know. Probably,
yeah.
That's the only place I can think of for them to go. So, actually, the Gallup survey is pretty consistent with the New York Times here in that, poor leadership, the government, whatever, is pretty high on the list of voter concerns. Also worth noting that in the New York Times survey, they pulled inflation off as a separate category to the economy. So when you when you add that back up into the economy, it was at 5% all by itself. So that if you put those together, that's 21% in that survey, which is pretty close to the most recent number for the voters saying the economy is the top problem in Gallup, which is 24% in September. Notably also in Gallup, that government poor leadership in September exceeds the economy at 28% by 4 points.
Ooh, okay. So they're being expressed in different ways, but they're actually finding the same thing, which is important, which is why it's important not to just read the write-up of the poll and actually go and look at the top line numbers or the crosstabs.
Yeah, exactly. So I think actually this is pretty consistent with conversations we've had in the past about the Gallup survey, how voters are saying the government or poor leadership is a big problem, sometimes the most important problem in this country. Only
recently most important. Like, it's been the economy for a long time now, but only in the past couple of months has government poor leadership or Democrats and Republicans saying each other outflanked the economy. So I think that is a new development.
There have been, I think over the past couple of years.
And last year, the second most important issue was immigration.
But I think we have seen points in the last few years where that government poor leadership, particularly during the first Trump administration, also popped up as a high issue in the Gallup polling. And yes, definitely this year, those two have been playing footsie for the top issue in Gallup.
Lenny, would you like the final word?
I don't have anything remotely as smart to say about this than what Mary said.
I don't believe you, Lenny.
I guess what I was sort of amused by is the fact that for independents, the top concern is polarization and division. Like when we talk about independents, we often sort of make the point that those are not centrists, right? Like there are many ways to be an independent and only a small chunk of them are centrists. But this is kind of exactly what you would imagine the centrist person to say to this question, which is that polarization is our biggest problem. So that did amuse me, but that is not, like I said, not even remotely as insightful as Mary just said.
I did want to flag one thing from this poll that I think is really fascinating. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. I really should write something about it. But flip through the crosstabs and just look at the gender gap on everything. It is so stark in this survey how far apart men and women are and how they view politics. Men are R plus 14 on the generic ballot. Women are D plus 15. Literally the opposite. Men approve of Trump plus 3, like net approval. Women are minus 23. It's incredible. So, give yourself a little treat and spend some time flipping through the crosstabs, looking at how men and women are really occupying like totally different political universes. It's really interesting. And I have a lot of questions about how this ultimately impacts society.
I often say polling tells us the what, not necessarily the why. And my strongest impulse right now is to ask you for hypotheses for why that is. But I'm actually going to say that we have to save that for a whole other podcast. Otherwise, we're not going to get to talk about Pennsylvania. And yes. I know that will make you deeply unhappy.
We have to talk about Pennsylvania. Okay,
so we're going to come back.
Methodology picking.
We're going to come back to the gender wars, the American gender wars, in favor of talking about Mr. Fetterman. So this Quinnipiac poll came out last week showing how Pennsylvania's politicians rank amongst Pennsylvanians. So Josh Shapiro, governor of Pennsylvania, doing pretty well, plus 32 with Pennsylvanians. 60% approve, 28% disapprove. Trump, not so hot, pretty actually almost extremely exactly reflective of the nation, 11 percentage points underwater, 54% disapprove, 43% approve. I think that's actually exactly what the New York Times showed as the national numbers. So, Mary, congratulations on living in the most American state.
There's a reason it's a swing state.
Okay, then we have Dave McCormick, new Republican senator from Pennsylvania. He's
allegedly.
+4. Allegedly a Republican or allegedly from Pennsylvania?
Allegedly
or allegedly a senator.
Or allegedly a
from
senator.
Pennsylvania.
Mary's an election truther, secretly. Okay, so put that to the side because that's not actually what we're talking about. And then we have Fetterman, who is the second most popular of the politicians that they asked about. He is +8 above water net approval. 46% of Pennsylvanians approve of the job that he's doing, 38% disapprove. Fantastic, Democrats would think. We have a popular senator in Pennsylvania. We're golden. We're going to be able to hold that seat for a while. But just you wait. When you actually look at the partisan breakdown of his approval rating, amongst Democratic voters in Pennsylvania, he's underwater by 21 percentage points. So 54% disapprove of his job. I'm saying so many numbers here. I apologize. I'm going to start characterizing. So a full-on majority of Democrats disapprove of the job that he's doing. And then an even bigger majority of Republicans approve of the job he's doing, 62%. And then those independents are exactly split, 43-43. So what does this mean for Fetterman? This spawned a whole mini economy of takes on the internet. I'll read 3 of them. So Yesh Ginsburg wrote, "Vibes-based politics make people so stupid. A liberal guy has a +40 rating amongst Republicans. If I was the DNC, I'd make him the nominee already. He'd make Reagan's 1984 victory look close." Okay, strong take. Next strong take here is from Michael. Fetterman facing the Kyrsten Sinema problem. He's most popular with Republican voters who might like him, but will never vote for him over a real Republican alternative. He's also become so unpopular with Dems that he can no longer win a primary. He has 3 options: change his party to Republican, change his party to Independent and have almost no path to win, or just retire and cash out in some AIPAC corporate lobbying gig. Okay, and then finally, we have a deleted tweet from Armand that says, "Not a Fetterman fan by any margin, but his 62-21 approval amongst Republicans, while mostly voting with Democrats, does show that the idea that a Democrat can't win over Republican-leaning voters is false." Those are the 3 genders, and I'm going to ask you to pick one. No, I'm kidding. But are all of those takes bad, or are any of them good?
I tend to sympathize most, if I have to pick one of the 3 genders, with the Kyrsten Sinema take here. And notably, Kyrsten Sinema did not try to run for re-election, knowing that she was deeply unpopular with Democratic voters, and so didn't want to have to lose a primary, and obviously felt she had no path to winning as an independent, which is probably true. I think that's probably the case for Fetterman. I think he's probably in real trouble here. Some may recall Connor Lamb, who won in a 2018 special election in Pennsylvania in the 18th district, stuck around in Congress for a few years. After that, moved to the 17th district because there was a redistricting issue. And then ran in the primary in 2022 against Fetterman, the first time that Fetterman ran for, well, I guess it's the second time that Fetterman ran for Senate, but the time that he actually won the primary. That was a close-fought primary. Connor Lamb did quite well. It wasn't like a blowout by any stretch of the imagination. And Connor Lamb has been out there on the political circuits in recent months. He's been doing a little speaking tour. He's shown up to some events where organizers said they invited Fetterman and McCormick to do town halls, and both of them declined. And so Connor Lamb is sort of filling in where those senators would have been to address the public. So there's a lot of speculation that Lamb will run again against Fetterman in a primary in 2028, or if Fetterman does not run, will run for the seat in 2028. The tough thing for any Pennsylvania politician, well, especially a Pittsburgh-based politician like Connor Lamb, is there's not really anything for him to do until 2028, right? There's no open seats locally that he could run for and hold some office. He's not going to challenge like a sitting incumbent for local office. He's not going to challenge Josh Shapiro for the governorship because, as you mentioned, Josh Shapiro is quite popular. Like around Pennsylvania, we had bridges that fell down in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and he fixed them both really fast. And those are like the things people know Josh Shapiro for. So very popular. So I think, that's the tricky thing is how do you maintain relevance for 3 more years if you're planning to challenge Fetterman? But I suspect that's what we're heading toward is either a primary challenger or Fetterman does not run again.
Lenny, do you agree?
I very much agree with the analysis, though I do also want to add that there is part of me that sympathizes with the first tweet, or maybe the third tweet, I don't remember, that a lot of this is incredibly vibes-based. I mean, like, Fetterman is what his voting record is like basically a generic Democrat. I think he votes with Democrats like 85 or 90% of the time or something. I don't exactly remember the number. What he says is sort of quite different. The way he talks is sort of quite different from where the Democratic median is. I mean, this is especially true most recently on Israel, but his voting record is still with the majority of the party so far on Israel, majority of the Senate party, I should say. Obviously, I think the base and, has moved substantially, but, majority of Democrats in the Senate are still voting, in support of Israel. And so is Fetterman. So obviously we'll see if that does shift more over the next couple of years. He will become probably more of an outlier if we take what he says at face value about his support. But so far, he still is pretty much smack dab in the middle there in a lot of these things. His voting record is, the way he speaks isn't. And so, I think a lot of this is vibes-based, effectively.
Yeah.
And it is interesting to me that it works both ways, that it's not just vibes that are turning Democrats off, but vibes that are also, turning Republicans on, I guess.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is he said stuff that made the Democrats mad. Therefore, I like him as a Republican or whatever.
Which I think is honestly an important lesson, that in this sort of politics by meme environment that we're in, and we can debate how much that's actually true and when the online conversation becomes unmoored from real life, and that does happen, but that you can shape people's perspective, views of you by even just in many ways, the language that you use, because Democrats and Republicans occupy these separate worlds in how they communicate and their cultural references. If a Democrat who votes with Democrats all the time in the Senate steals all of the political cultural language of Republicans, they can still convince Republicans that they're on their team, or at least not just sort of your generic lived out Dem who you'd never vote for, right? I mean, Fetterman uses the term illegal immigration or illegal immigrant or whatever instead of undocumented. And that's already telling voters something about you in a world where the parties don't even use the same language.
I will say, though, that's not new at all, right? I mean, there's this old trope from British politics from the 19th century that what people actually want is Whig measures and Tory men. So liberal policies executed by conservative politicians or conservative seeming politicians. So the fact that you can sort of create a brand for yourself, quite successful political brand, by executing one kind of politics, but talking and acting like a different kind of politician, I mean, that's been true for hundreds of years.
I knew we would get in a European reference, Lenny, and I wasn't disappointed.
What's so interesting about that is I think that you see both from Fetterman and from Trump to some extent, sort of a Democratic Party as it was 30 years ago on certain issues. You look at tariffs, and that was a far left position was trade protectionism and things like that in the 90s. And then now, sometime 30 years down the road, that's become a Republican position because Trump cares about it. I don't think anybody else in the Republican Party would have done this if it weren't for Donald Trump. But it's also one of the issues that Fetterman is on the other side of from the majority of the Democratic Party, right? So I feel like he's just a little bit more old school Democrat than some of what the party wants these days. I actually think Trump is a little bit old school Democrat also. So you're saying, yep. I don't remember the parties because it's Britain and we have had a war, so we don't have to think about them anymore. But Democratic policy from a Republican man.
Another place where you can see this is immigration, where I think a lot of Fetterman's criticism of the Biden immigration policies come from the left, and that historically has existed as a form of criticism. I mean, I think Bernie Sanders doesn't like to be reminded of this, or at least he didn't like to be reminded of this in 2016 and 2020, but he used to be quite opposed to mass migration because his argument was that undercuts wages, the sort of left-wing argument for reducing immigration. Mm-hmm. And I mean, Fetterman's criticism of the Biden administration on immigration has been very much focused on that also.
All right. Well, this is the kind of podcast that feels like it could last another hour, but I am not going to do that. and we'll just have to get back together sometime, and we'll bring up some of these themes. We'll talk about the gender war in American politics, but we're going to leave it there for today. Thank you for joining me today, Lenny and Mary.
Thanks, Galen.
Great to be here as always.
Great to have you. My name is Galen Druk. Remember to become a subscriber to this podcast at gdpolitics.com and wherever you listen to podcasts. Paid subscribers get about twice the number of episodes and access to the video for the podcast. You can also join our paid subscriber chat and pass along questions for us to discuss on the show. And most importantly, you ensure that we keep making this podcast. Also, if you're so inclined, be a friend of the pod and go give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen. Thanks for listening, and we will see you soon.